East and the West in search of truth were known press. In addition to that, he has published many reputed papers in very reputed journals such as Political Theory, Journal of Islamic and Muslim Studies, and the Journal of Religion. In general, Dr. Jan works on Islamic intellectual history, comparative political theory, and Islamic political thought. So that's about our esteemed guest speaker for today, and we actually thank Dr. Jan for accepting our invitation and to share his insights with us today. Finally, let me share a few information about today's program. Firstly, about the structure of the program. Our speaker, Dr. Jan, will present his ideas for roughly 35 to 40 minutes. And then we will open up the floor for Q&A session and comment session. Our participants can share if there are any question they can ask. The participant even can ask the question directly by unmuting themselves, or they can write their questions in the chat box. So now it's time to listen to our guest speaker, Dr. Jan. And without further ado, I would like to invite again Dr. Jan Islam to share his ideas on Islamic political philosophy within the context of political modernity. Thank you. Dr. Jan, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zaki, for your extraordinary introduction and for your very kind invitation for me to speak at your seminar. It's a pleasure and honor to speak with you and all of our attendants and participants today. And I see this as hopefully as a start of a relationship as opposed to just a one-time thing. So thank you once again. Regarding myself, I think you've covered everything. So yes, yeah, I'm currently assistant professor of political science at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, and the paper that I'll be presenting today is sort of bits and pieces from different papers I've written, in addition to some new things, which I hope will sort of tackle the questions that I think a lot of us will have. A lot of us have regarding the relationship between Islamic political thought and modernity. And I'll also mention that I'll try my best to keep it within the time. So for that reason, I might rush through a few places. If I do that, and if some parts of the presentation are unintelligible, please take a note and feel free to ask me at the end of the class or at the end of the lecture. So the first thing, I guess, is that my paper discusses, my presentation evaluates the question of the extent of continuity of Islamic political thought or pre-modern Islamic political thought in a post-colonial context. So insofar as we're trying to derive, let's say, a framework for normative Islamic political theory, and the reality of the modern state and modernity poses a challenge or an obstacle or a theoretical challenge, at least, to that. What are the factors that we need to consider in formulating an Islamic political theory in the modern context? One, perhaps, that is reflexive, that is self-aware of both the past and the present. The first place I want to start with is, as Talal Asad mentioned, any attempt to derive or to empirically study, let's say, Islamic society or anthropology or society must start with the original sources, so to speak, the Quran and the Hadith, as he mentioned. And the reason is very simple. Tradition can develop over time, and it can change, and it can have different interpretations, but you have to know what the sort of original statements are. And these are the original statements, these verses and these Hadith, that the pre-modern jurists had in mind when they were formulating their political theory, even if they didn't always quote them. Often they did quote them, but even if they weren't, they had them on mind. The first is the verse 30 of Surah Al-Baqarah, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. When your Lord said to the angels, indeed, I will make upon the earth a Khalifa. And just to mention, I won't go into the details of these verses and these hadith, but just to mention very quickly that this was the inspiration for a number of exegetes, including Al-Tabari, including Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir, etc., to situate or locate the obligation of the caliphate and Islamic authority in this verse. Similarly, there are a number of hadith. One of them is the very famous hadith. In fact, one you might hear in the average Friday khutbah, which is that you must stick to my sunnah and the sunnah of the rightly guided caliphs. Hold on to them or bite them with your molar teeth. So it's again showing something that there is an ideal or there is a something worthy of imitation. And there is a not necessarily a utopia by any means, but there is a legal and moral, virtuous society to which the Muslim Ummah can aspire to realize throughout the course of history. Similarly, we have the hadith that the caliphate of prophecy will last for 30 years. So again, situating this time period to that of the four orthodox, rightly guided orthodox caliphs in the Sunni tradition. And similarly, into another hadith, again, one which is considered by both pre-modern and contemporary scholars, that describes the stages through which the Muslim Ummah will go through in terms of political stages, if we think in terms of, say, democracy, tyranny, aristocracy, monarchy, and of course, the caliphate as a separate individual and unique category. You have this, very interesting hadith quoted by or narrated by Imam Ahmad, that prophethood will last for as long as Allah wills it to be, and then remove it when He wills. Then there will be khilafa ala minhaj al-nubuwwah, or caliphate upon the prophetic method, and that will last as long as Allah wills, and He will remove it when He wills. Then this will be succeeded by mulkan addan, or biting rule, which some have sort of described or interpreted as oppressive or monarchical rule. Others have interpreted as a long-lasting dynastic succession because it's long-lasting, it's biting, and then that will be succeeded by mulkan jabriyatan, or extremely oppressive tyrannical rule. And some of them have mentioned that to sort of despotic rule, military rule, or let's say something which is similar to totalitarianism, where every aspect of a person's life is controlled by the modern state. I think more recent theorists have focused and provided that interpretation. The bottom line is that this ends with the ultimate redemption of humanity and the salvation of humanity, the redemption of the message of Islam in Islamic eschatology, which establishes that indeed the end of the world will be concluded, or that the world will not end until it is concluded with a revival of that same method that the Prophet ﷺ established 1400 years ago. So these are the original sources, and these are the ideas that the fuqaha have in mind. Now, just like the realm of jurisprudence, we can say fiqh is translatable to jurisprudence. Fiqh is interested in the prescriptive knowledge, divine prescriptive knowledge, whether that's an obligation or a permission or a prohibition or another category of the Creator upon the individual person, or upon the creation, or upon the slave of the Creator. Within the development of fiqh, and within the development, or together with the development of Islamic jurisprudence in the first centuries of Islam, you have, of course, many aspects of fiqh which intersect with political power. And I don't want to go on for too long about this because we have a lot to cover. But if you think about prayer or fasting, zakat, there is always an aspect that relates to government and political authority. So if we're talking about, let's say, the obligation to pray, if you're talking about the collection of the zakat by the Khalifa, the Hajj being led by someone appointed by the Khalifa, even the 5 pillars of Islam, beyond the 5 pillars, marriage and divorce law, and everything else is really concerned with, let's say, the caring of orphans who don't have anyone to look after them, the paying of blood money if no one is able to pay, that sort of thing. relates to political authority. And so after the development of the four, let's say, classic Sunni madhabs, Sunni, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Hanbali, etc., you have an interesting development of a genre within fiqh proper, which we could call fiqh as-siyasa, or the jurisprudence of politics, or the jurisprudence of government, alternatively al-ahkam al-sultaniya, or sultanic rulings, rulings of fiqh pertaining to the sultan and pertaining to that aspect of political power. And the first source of this tradition, which really was founded in the 11th century, so a few hundred years after Hijrah, 3-4 centuries after Hijrah, they were concerned first with the theological aspect of the caliphate. Of course, the institution of the caliphate, existed before then, but in the theological and the creedal aspect of the caliphate, especially as a repudiation of Shi'ism and the 12 Imam doctrines, the 12 Imams doctrine was articulated in creedal manuals and theological manuals, including Usul al-Sunnah of Imam Ahmad, al-Baqillani, al-Juwayni, and other scholars. This was then again taken into the realm of fiqh, of sort of proper jurisprudence, and include important works like that of Abu Ma'ali al-Juwayni, who was the teacher of al-Ghazali in the Seljuk period, and a very important jurist and theologian himself. He wrote the book called The Savior of the Nations, which is a very granular analysis of the rulings of the Sultan and of Islamic government. Similarly, al-Mawardi and Abu Ya'la, respectively Shafi'i and Hanbali jurists, who wrote separate works with the same title, the rulings of the sultanic rulings and Ahkam al-Sultaniya. And it's said that Abu Ya'la's work is in fact a summarization or a modification of al-Mawardi's work. So it's not necessarily completely an independent work. And then finally, later on during the Mamluk period, you have another sort of rejuvenation of this field by Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, who has a work with a similar title, by Tajuddin al-Subki, Mu'id al-Ni'am, wa Mubid al-Niqam, and several others, until you get to the Ottoman period. And the Ottoman period is a different subject altogether. The point here is that you had the initial development of this field within jurisprudence, and this was really the mainstay of Islamic political thought. Islamic political thought was by no means restricted to jurisprudence. However, it was initially articulated under the rulings and under the frameworks of Islamic law, because in the end of the day, Islamic law is and was seen as the ultimate relationship or the connection between human and the divine. And insofar as the divine is the source of the knowledge, then you would have the discernment of that knowledge is what deserves to be applied in a political system or otherwise. Now, examples, again, there's some examples here. I won't focus too much on them. The concerns or the questions that this field of literature is concerned with include the requirements of the caliph, the requirements that allow for the legitimate appointment of a caliph, the procedure through which the caliph is appointed, including whether the caliph takes over by force, if that can be understood as, if that is recognized as legitimate or not, how succession is to be undertaken, what are the duties and the obligations of let's say, the institution of the caliphate in terms of collecting tax, in terms of guarding the borders, resolving disputes, implementing the law, establishing the hudud, and all of the other questions, fighting, say, different components, quelling rebellions. Those are all questions that were undertaken within fiqh al-siyasa. The types of discussions that these scholars would have are there were definitely numerous, just like in any other field of jurisprudence. But just to give you an example or a cross-section, you have the argument as to whether not fulfilling certain conditions of the caliphate rendered the caliphate as invalid. So if the imam was not descended from Quraysh, for instance, if the imam took over by force as opposed to through appointment. And there were some jurists, al-Juwayni, for instance, regarding the Qurayshi imam, who held that actually it wouldn't be legitimate. You can't you can't have a caliph who does his job if the method through which he was appointed was not itself sanctioned by Islamic law. Al-Ghazali takes issue with this because for him, this is essentially saying that the institution of Islamic government is invalid because in his time, again, in the Seljuk period, the executive authority of government was being practiced by the Seljuk vizier as opposed to the Khalifa, who met those conditions. And even the Khalifa himself would not have met many of the conditions stipulated by Al-Juwayni, for instance, being a mujtahid, right? You can't monarchical succession doesn't really grant for choosing people outside of the family, and so it's possible that the leader or the Khalifa would be wouldn't be able to, wasn't really qualified to do their job. Al-Ghazali is saying that, look, ideally there's a certain way of doing things, but if you were to apply this in practice, here's what he says. Who would not agree with this argument and would decree the invalidity of the imamate in our times because of the absence of its conditions, while he is incapable of replacing the person filling the position? So which situation is better, to say that the judges are discarded, are discharged, and public functions are invalid, and marriages cannot be contracted, and all of the transactions and holders of public office across the world cannot be implemented, and that all of creation is engaged in sin, or to say that the imamate is contracted and that the transactions and the public functions can be implemented? In other words, he's saying that there is a political reality, and the legitimacy of the entirety of Islamic society hinges upon the caliphate, and therefore there should be space created for accepting the legitimacy of Islamic authorities, even if they don't fulfill all of the conditions. More of sort of a realpolitik approach. This realpolitik approach, or this contention between practice and ideal, is something that was expanded by Ibn Taymiyyah. And so Ibn Taymiyyah is coming, a few centuries after Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was the first one to sort of point towards this non-ideal political thought. But it was, in my view, it was more systemically articulated by Ibn Taymiyyah, because if you look at Ibn Taymiyyah's work, As-Siyasa Shari'iyya, it is similar in theory, or at least in genre, to that of Al-Juwayni. But in the book, Ibn Taymiyyah is not that much concerned about the proper way of appointing a caliph. He's not interested in the succession. He's not interested even in whether or not monarchy is permissible. He said, look, it might be permissible, it might not be permissible. What he is saying, though, in the content of his work, you'll find discussions of what the leader should be doing, about how people should be appointed to different jobs, how let's say the offices of government should be organized, and if they're organized in a certain way, how they can be improved and brought closer to the Sunnah. What should be the relationship of the flock, the shepherd and the flock, of the population towards certain decisions undertaken by the government, even if they are less than ideal. Should the leader undertake, let's say, a consultation? So Ibn Taymiyyah, as a theme, is interested in taking improving a non-ideal situation. He's taking politics as it is and saying, look, here's how we can make it better. Because me saying that the Mamluk Sultan is illegitimate isn't going to get me anywhere. I can say it and I can write a book on it, but in the end of the day, how are we going to implement this in practice? So Ibn Taymiyyah was the one to sort of change the theme. Many of the Mamluk works of fiqh siyasa imitated this, and they had similar contentions. They were engaged in practical critique of the Mamluk Sultanate. Ibn Jama'ah, similarly, he proposed the theorization. Just leave that there. Theorization of the Khalifa who does meet the conditions of the Caliph, basically delegating the duties of the Caliph to the Sultan, so that technically can be considered legitimate. Again, he was also in the Mamluk period. So there is this theme again takes more importance, perhaps due to in response to geopolitical difficulties, the Mongol invasions, and other concerns that the ulama were dealing with in the time. The point here is, again, these are Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, and Al-Ghazali, the others, they are dealing from the perspective of, or they're looking at things from the perspective of Islamic law, about what is right, what is wrong, what is the prescriptive knowledge that God has informed us, has informed, in the Quran and the Hadith, and how can I implement that in practical reality. There is a certain extent of ijtihad, or sort of taking the ideal ruling and implementing in practice. That is an active agency on behalf of the jurist. However, there is a different, at the same time, it is restricted to jurisprudence. And my point is that there is a different theme within Islamic political thought, pre-modern Islamic political thought, that takes place outside the sphere of jurisprudence. This is not to say that jurisprudence for these scholars is not important. It is important, and it is practical. However, they begin to theorize society and politics along sociological or classical philosophical. Of course, philosophy was, it's not modern philosophy, but let's say pre-modern philosophy, which included natural sciences, included sociology, included historiography, and other fields. The point here is there was a turn or a different perspective that sought to illuminate or elucidate the wisdom behind those rulings. So if you want to put it in terms of in Islamic legal language, you could say that Islamic law is concerned with the illah. It is concerned with the Quran or the Hadith that lays down the law, the cause for the law to be implemented, whether a ruler is legitimate or illegitimate, what are the obligations upon the ruler, etc. And then there's the hikmah, or the wisdom behind that law. This is something referred to by scholars of usul al-fiqh. They say that the scholars, they say that the wisdom of the law, although it is not determinant of the rule, is still important to understanding why we implement the law to begin with. So if I say, why is alcohol prohibited? You can say, oh, it's damaging to your rationality, it's bad for your health, it's a cause for crime in society. That is the philosophical and sociological aspect. So this was something introduced by several scholars, and I refer to two, Ibn Rushd and Ibn Khaldun, who supplemented Islamic law with this sort of additional concern or this additional perspective. So Ibn Khaldun, as you can see here, he does not forego or eschew the legal aspect. He says, yes, this is the law and this is what's obligated. However, in theorizing behind the wisdom for certain rulings, for instance, why monarchy is inferior to the rightly guided caliphate, why monarchy should be avoided in terms of implementation, he gives an example, or he gives a sociological explanation that royal authority requires superiority and force, which expresses the wrathfulness and animality of human nature. The decisions of the ruler will therefore deviate from what is right, and therefore it is necessary to have reference to ordained political norms, which are accepted by the mass and whose laws it submits. You have to have a sort of there has to be a certain level, perhaps I'm reading into Ibn Khaldun, there has to be a certain level of localization and decentralization of the law so that it can be properly implemented with harmony into the societies that they are governing. It can't be a uniform law based on the whim of an individual, or if I were to extend that argument in modernity, of a constitution or a centralizing power, then implementing that legal system from the top down. Again, it's not a legal argument per se, but it allows us to understand why certain rulings may or may not be legal or permissible. Ibn Rushd, similarly, in his commentary, Ibn Rushd's primary work on political thought is a commentary on Plato's Republic, most likely because he didn't have access to Aristotle's Politics. because as we know, he normally writes commentaries on Aristotle. In any case, although Ibn Rushd is, I think, interpreted by modern scholars in different ways, I think he is misinterpreted, whether it is as a feminist or as a communist or as a Platonist. This is something I argue in a paper, and you're free to read that. If you look at Ibn Rushd's sort of idealization or his thought experiment on the virtuous society, he identifies, sort of using Plato's model of the notion of the philosopher king. He identifies the philosopher king in the Islamic tradition. He doesn't say in the Islamic tradition, he says the philosopher king is the Sharia. It is the lawgiver, that is the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and the Imam, whose job it is to extract that divine knowledge and implement it to the best of their ability in the real world. This divine law, in other words, the divine law is the so-called nomos. It is the Sharia. This is in contrast to Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi was, if I remember him correctly, was basically viewed the Sharia as a reflection of, or an articulation of, the divine nomos, which sort of transcends the Sharia. This, for a traditional scholar like Ibn Rushd, who was also a jurist and a mujtahid and the chief judge of Cordoba, and a traditional Islamic scholar, would say, no, that's basically tantamount to disbelief. It's saying that the Quran, the knowledge contained in the Quran, is inferior to some other form of knowledge that someone can attain, and that is definitely not acceptable. But rather, our attempt to discern the divine law is the sole source for uncovering that knowledge of the virtuous society, and this is what reason would lead to. In other words, by the only way of knowing this matter is that God wills of them is of what it is that God wills of them is prophecy. He gives another example, again, similar to Ibn Khaldun, approaching it from a philosophical perspective. He's sort of critiquing democracy, he's critiquing monarchy, hedonistic rule, democratic rule, and showing or demonstrating through historical case studies why it is subpar, or leads to an unsustainable form of government. He gives an example of the Murabitun, who started off upon the nomos, upon the Sharia, and this was great in the beginning. However, again, similar to Ibn Khaldun, starts off good. They're coming from the Bedouin lands. They implement the rule, but then it turns into democratic rule, self-interest, that kind of thing, and then love of wealth, and then it degenerates. Similarly, the Muwahidun came and they replaced that with their governments based on the nomos, and the same thing happened again. So again, you have a very different, I think, a method of evaluating and discussing Islamic political thought. They were not in contradiction to each other, but they occurred together as different dimensions or sides of the same coin. Now, I feel very regretful almost to jump from Ibn Khaldun to the modern state, because there's so much to be said in between. But because this is a theoretical analysis and not a historical analysis, I can justify that. Looking at modernity in the modern state, there's a lot to say about the modern state. I don't know how good I am on time. How many minutes am I through?
Dr. J, you can go up to 15 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to try my best, also to be succinct, but there are so many issues. It's going to be hopefully be able to do it. So the modern state is of course, needless to say, brought a very different perspective and style of government, and a very different ideological foundation to that of Islamic law and that of the Islamic paradigm. We have to remember, though, that the Islamic paradigm came first. So when we're theorizing Islamic political thought as a response to modernity, we can also remember that Islam preceded modernity. In any case, the modern state, modernity, is concerned with the study of the individual. It is concerned with the individual human and the ability of the mind, of rationality, to dominate and control nature. It is a very artificial construction of of law, of politics, of society. One instead of focusing on balance, on reciprocity, on harmony with nature, on let's say interaction with the divine, sustainable living, sustainable circular notions of time and of politics, like that of Ibn Khaldun. It's very different. It focuses on the linear. It introduced the notion of progress. It sacrificed morality and ethics at the expense of short-term economic and political development. And it was interested in, again, short-term domination over nature, not realizing the horrible economic and environmental and social consequences that this would have later on. So modernity is a very sort of specific way of looking at the world and of designing and of governing society. The origins of the modern state are start with the Treaty of Westphalia, with sort of initial recognition of some kind of governed territory or sovereignty. This really was not solidified until World War II, where the notion of defined territory, in Weber's definition, with a state monopoly over that territory or over quote unquote legal violence, was enshrined until it was enshrined in the United Nations Charter in 1945. So that is really the modern state is something which is rather new and was implemented through colonialism over the previous century. Some of the features of the modern state besides being a defined territory is the political and economic centralization of public services, of education. What I call both prescriptive and ontological knowledge was monopolized by the state. So you know what is right and wrong from the state, legal and illegal, and similarly what is true and false, because the state controls all of those aspects of knowledge production. Similarly, the economic side of things with industrialization, you had the state's need to control those increasing urban centers and therefore high levels of taxation and an increasing role of the state in regulating and governing society. Look at the GDP, in the pre-modern period let's say the government expenditure as a percentage of GDP from 2 to 4% to 20 to 40% today. The number of bureaucrats from 100 in the Topkapi Palace in 1500 to something like 12,000 in the 1900s. So again, big developments and differences. There is also the need to rationalize these forms of power and control over these new societies and these urbanizing, industrialized societies. That is what we can call bureaucracy or rationalization, the redefinition of authority, decision-making, and everything that it entails from let's say traditional forms of power and organization, whether that's the tribe, whether it is the local community, the neighborhood, etc. Values, Islamic values, merit, taqwa, whatever you want to call it, or any combination of those things, to standardized, centralized, and uniform procedures that are quote unquote empirically observable and quote unquote objective and secular. Similarly, and finally, you have the notion of citizenship, where political allegiance is based on soil. It is based on the place that you were born. The state is the source of your rights, and therefore it is the object of political allegiance, and therefore the state has the right and the authority to sacrifice its members and its subjects in order to contain its existence, because it is the primary form, or it became the primary form of social organization and therefore of human rights of the nation and everything else. So colonialism, very long story short, was, and very succinctly and very briefly and perhaps erroneously, but in the interest of time, it was the implementation of the modern state system in an artificial manner upon Islamic society in the Muslim world. That included a redefinition of government, of lawmaking, of legitimacy and popular legitimacy reformed along the way of nation state. It included the introduction of or industrialization and the opening of trade, the globalization of the economy, and dependency on the West, dependency on technology, dependency on foreign aid, which was really essential to the secularization procedures and secularization processes after colonialism. Before colonialism, during colonialism, it was, of course, through direct imposition. It includes the reformation of the political economy of those societies. So from waqfs, where waqf beneficiaries and waqf, let's say, managers, the ulama, and other people over the thousands of awqaf in each city had authority over the communities and the societies and provided public goods and services, were switched and sort of derooted from their societies and brought to the state. And then finally, it includes a redefinition of Islamic law. And what Talal Asad mentions is the rendering of Islamic law into a subdivision of Islamic norms that are authorized and maintained by the centralizing state, instead of there being a standard above and beyond the state, which of course is the Sharia, not limited or bounded by political authority. Now, having said all of this, we are now brought with the question. We now have the question: how, as Islamic political theorists and as Muslims, should we approach the modern state? How can we theorize an Islamic government that, whether it likes to or not, must acknowledge the reality of modernity and the modern state? Is it complete rejection? Is it adoption? Is it compromise? Is it something else? And I'm not going to give you the answer to that question and say it is this. Right? I have my own theories and my own ideas, and you're free to look them up. But what I'm interested in today is discussing those factors and those issues we have to consider in theorizing Islamic government to begin with. What are those critical issues that we have to acknowledge if we're going to have this discussion? And the first thing that I think we need to do is reorient the discussion. When we look at Islam versus modernity, or we ask ourselves, to what extent should Islam accept modernity? Or if we take the Halakian view that, let's say, all aspects of modernity are sort of damaging to the ethos of Islamic ethics, or maybe they're not necessarily, but because because those systems of life have been imposed on the Muslim world, it's not really possible for the Muslims to recover from that. If I take that as a standard and then say that the point here is this, if I take that as a standard, if I take halakha as a standard and then say, oh, I'm going to determine whether or not something is morally compromising to Islamic ethics, and therefore it is Islamic or not, I'm not taking an Islamic approach. The result might be the same as an Islamic approach. You might take an Islamic approach and arrive at the same result, right? A lot of the things that halakha says is really agreeable by a number of Muslim jurists. That's not the problem. The problem is, what is the process and what is the paradigm or the intellectual worldview that we take as an axis through which we discern that truth, through which we discern whether X about modernity is Islamic or not. Even the categorization of modernity and its opposition towards Islam is not necessarily an Islamic, it's not necessarily Islamic categorization itself. That's a dichotomy that you created. I'm not saying that it is or it isn't true. I'm saying that using modernity versus Islam as a basis for comparison has certain implications. And we need to be aware of those implications through a meta characterization of reality, which we can call the Islamic approach. That is really an individual's person, their interaction, and their understanding of the divine revelation. We have to go back to that source and recreate the worldview from that source. In my study of Islamic political theory and what we discussed so far, there are really three realms or dimensions through which Islamic political arguments can be made. One of them is perhaps the one which is the most common, I think, in post-Islamic movements today, in the post-colonial society, is that which is based on what we can call Tawheed. the notion that of divine sovereignty, of divinity, divine unity, monotheism, and therefore it follows from that monotheism that Muslims are united. They have allegiance towards one another as opposed to pieces of land or opposed to tribe or other forms of social organization. And the notion that there is always a legal standard of perfection that transcends the state and transcends political authorities. And therefore, any constitution or sovereignty or state government must heed to the eternal truths and legal standards that transcend an individual government and which are contained in the Quran and the Sunnah. Many of the ulama and the leaders of the Islamic movements and theorists in the 20th century articulated the Islamic State along this dimension. It's not to say that they're wrong in doing so, but that is one dimension. There is another dimension, which is that of fiqh, or that of Islamic law. Islamic law, the beauty of Islamic law is Islamic law has five categorizations, as you know: obligatory, recommended, permissible, disliked, and prohibited. There is no aspect of human life, or there is no action or phenomenon in human existence that does not fall under one of the five categories. It either falls under one of the five, one of the four, or it belongs under permissible. So the point here is fiqh as a comprehensive framework in of itself is capable of discerning prescriptive facts and statutes and legislations. Even if you say that I'm going to do something imperfect, let's say eating pork because you have nothing else to eat, the fuqaha will tell you how you should eat that pork, where you should eat that pork, and how often you should eat it, because that is included under the realm of Islamic law, which is the law of necessity. The point here is that let's say the people who focus on this are drawing upon the corpus of Islamic law the last 1400 years and are implementing with their own ijtihad to the best of their ability these different prescriptions in their local communities in the absence of Islamic unity in government. And there are some examples of that. Finally, you have a different approach. I don't think that is different. I think it is included within the overall framework, but one that is often left out. And this is the notion of ikhlas, or the notion of sincerity. Akhlaq, the perfection and the refinement of character, the refinement of virtue. The cultivation of virtue in society is based on the cultivation of virtue of the individual. And if the individual does not purify themselves, if they do not engage in purification, if they do not have control over undesirable aspects of, let's say, of satanic temptations, if they do not, if they allow for their bad qualities, whether that is pride or it is hedonism, this is something Ibn Rushd mentioned in great detail, or it is hedonism or special interest or it's property rights, if we allow for any of these private desires of the soul to enter into the sphere of government, then that is going to threaten the sustainability of any Islamic system. It's going to if I create pious subjects and individuals by imposing morality from the top down, is that possible or not? Now, the argument of the neo-traditionalists, as much as I disagree with them, the argument of halaq, similarly, is that no, there has to be an individual cultivation of those akhlaq through ikhlas, which is the tool or the means by which someone reaches ihsan, which is, as the Prophet ﷺ said, to worship Allah as if you can see him, whereas you cannot see him, but he can see you. And many of the critiques of the modern state and the formation of the subjects through centralized education, etc., mass media, are made upon this basis. It is a moral objection. And my point here is that this moral objection does not lie outside of the Quran or the Sunnah. This moral objection does not rely outside of fiqh. And this was Ibn Khaldun's point. He's saying that no, this moral objection, if I tell you that you have to cultivate ikhlas in a certain way, this is, of course, a reality in divine revelation. And what I'm saying is the rule of fiqh, if we have two options, we should choose A instead of B, because it is more conducive to the formation of Islamic ethics. Why? Because in this society, this is the opinion that's more likely to make sense and more likely to cultivate those pious individuals. So it is we can say that ikhlas is the bridge between fiqh and between the illah and the hikmah, between the wisdom behind why certain rulings, exist, and the fact that they are rulings, which of course is the realm of fiqh. I'm going to give two practical examples before finishing the talk. Very sorry for going over time, but it's going to be worth it because this is the point I wanted to make. One example is that of crime and punishment. And this is something I made in my Umatics paper, so you're free to refer to that as well. I proposed a model of Islamic government and its approach to crime and punishment, and contrasted that to the Western, the model of the colonial state. In the colonial states, the source of volition, or the ideal subject, the ideal citizen, does not undertake, let's say, infractions. It does not. It remains submissive to the state out of fear. It is surveillance. It is the implicit, let's say, power and the threat of the state, which through its rules and its rationalization and its principles disciplines the soul into certain behaviors and opinions. So the prison system, for instance, is I think reflective of this, the state as the source of volition. This is actually the reason I included the panopticon. I think this is a very nice model that summarizes the difference between these two models. Whereas in Islamic thought, it is fear of one's creator. It is the fact that one's heart turns towards their creator that gives them the internal sense of fear and shame, and at the same time the desire to do good and to excel in virtue beyond merely not doing something out of fear. Similarly, if you look at the source of knowledge is Islamic thought. It is the creator. It is something that is there's an eternal fear and hope outside of worldly gain that conducts and provides harmony in worldly matters and worldly affairs. On the other hand, the state is interested in culturing, in educating, in cultivating citizens who are responsive to the animalistic desire of positive, the carrot and the stick, so to speak, the justice system and the education system. Similarly, the method of enforcement, instead of local community, for the Islamic system is focused on local community efforts, Islamic education, the concept of da'wah, the purification of the self, let's say, the creation of brotherhoods or fraternities which encourage ethical conduct on the one hand, to on the other hand, centralized, let's say, education, media, the creation of a civil religion. Again, secularism was never able to free itself from religion. It needed the symbolism. It needs the rituals and the culture of a religion, but it's simply re-articulated in the form of a civil religion, which focuses on the dunya or focuses on the role of the state, as opposed to, of course, Islam as a totality. What are the sources that I can derive this model from? Number one, there is a hadith on encouraging. There's the hadith which basically encourages the cultivation of shame and individual repentance to God, as opposed to punishing that individual for the crime they committed. There's a hadith which states that if the state follows let's say, follows the sins of the people, that they're going to corrupt them. There is Omar's famous story where he was told not to spy on people who were drinking alcohol in their house in the streets of Medina. You have a number of fiqh siyasa works which actually, very interestingly, articulate this and critique their own political authorities for not adhering to these principles. If they critique their political authorities, the Mamluk state, for doing that, imagine what they would say about the modern state, which is far more intrusive and more powerful than anything that a Subki has ever seen, for instance. And the fields that we have to engage in order to derive these, you need fiqh, you need usul, you need aqidah, you need tafsir. And for that reason, the Islamic sciences must go hand in hand with Islamic political thought. the argument, and this is my point here, you can make the argument in terms of halak. Halak said that this is against Islamic morality, and that's convincing to me. But for me, that's not a systemic argument. A systemic argument is say, no, halak's right in this area. Why on, let's say, on surveillance, because you have plenty of evidence both in fiqh and in akhlaq and in sociology, which would all suggest that this ruling, namely that surveillance in public areas is, or in private areas or in public areas or whatever it is not conducive to social harmony, and it is also against the Sharia, is a far more convincing, compelling, and systemic argument that one can make. Another example is taxation. All of our criticisms of the nation state are on the basis that taxes that are permitted because the state is given the power. Sorry, the power of the state is permitted because it has the money to fund all of those rearticulations of or the redefining and reconstitutions of Islamic society. The state has the ability to centralize. It can fund public education. It can fund healthcare. It can fund a massive standing army through all of the taxes that it has. And that's why the institutions of this nation state came hand to hand together with the increase in government as an expenditure as a percentage of GDP. Now, if you look at the ulama's view on taxation before the Ottoman period, you can see a very interesting trend, which is the notion of the makkas, or the individual who collects extrajudicial taxes beyond the zakah and the kharaj and ghanima. There is one opinion, I believe it's the Hanafi opinion, in fact, which states that the makkas, you are entitled to resist the makkas taking away your wealth, even if it means that you kill him. That was the level of, let's say, that was the extreme level that the fuqaha went to in opposing extrajudicial taxes. They're not talking about a situation of war. They're not talking about extreme famine. They're saying, on a general, in general terms, if there isn't extreme necessity, then this is simply stealing. It's not permissible, even if it's the ruler who's doing it. And for that reason, if you look at the Quran, look at the Hadith, the Kharaj, look at the Zakat, look at the Ghanima. Besides that, the notion of the hurma of the Muslim, or the Muslim being holy and sacred, and his life and his wealth not being touchable by any authority, including the state, can be implemented in this, in this line of argumentation. And it can also, this is the same line of argumentation, you can look at it from a moral perspective, or from an akhlaq perspective, or from a sociological perspective, from a Khaldunian perspective, and say, actually, this makes a lot of sense because the decentralization of a state is far more ideal and far more conducive to social harmony. It empowers local ulama and local authorities to govern themselves. It encourages the creation and the reestablishment of the awqaf as opposed to state centralization. And so from an al-Halakian perspective and a Khaldunian perspective, this view of jurisprudence actually goes together. Again, I'm not saying that this is the correct opinion, or this is the only correct opinion, but what I'm saying is this is the means through which we can undertake a theorization of Islamic thought. Look at all these different perspectives. In this regard, look at Shahzad Korkut, who's writing, the Shahzad Korkut is the grandson of Sultan Fatih Mehmet, and he was in line for the throne. However, it would be Sultan Salim who took the throne, and Shahzad Korkut was killed shortly after, along with his brother Shahzad Ahmed. The point here is Shahzad Korkut said that he was a very interesting figure because he was against the Ottoman Empire's taxation, unlawful taxation, and many of their legal reforms, which later permitted for further reform during the nation-state period. The example that he gives here in this quote is taxation. He says that some of our scholars of Hanafi lands belittle studying these books, meaning books of fiqh, examining bits and pieces of the Hidayah, meaning the Hidayah is the book of Hanafi fiqh, and that too only to justify forbidden taxes charged by the judiciary. So my point here is, look at fiqh al-siyasa, you have fiqh, you have usul, you have aqidah, hadith, tafsir, sociology. All of these subjects are coming together in order to propose an interpretation of Islamic thought, or a model of Islamic government in a post-colonial context. And so I'll end here by mentioning just some of the principles, or some proposed principles that at least have been useful for myself in understanding my role as a political theorist. What are the things that I can focus on and I can perhaps hopefully be useful to the ummah with. There are some principles, and those correspond to areas of exploration. The first is the notion of the paradigm shift. I mentioned this many times, that both prescriptive and ontological knowledge, your epistemology for both law and for knowledge, reality, and truth, your epistemology for truth and law are relegated back to the original sources of Islam. This is something that you can if you're looking at it from a political perspective, you can look at the Islamic evidences regarding the concept of shura. The modernists have a certain interpretation, understanding of shura that, let's say, mimics liberal democratic norms. Is that really the case? What is is there any evidence that we can derive in order to propose an alternative model? Secondly, we have the revival of fiqh al-siyasa. I think that fiqh as jurisprudence, because it is extremely important for the Muslim community, because it is an ongoing tradition alive for 1400 years. This is something that needs to be brought back into the political spirit as well. And this differentiation of jurisprudence from theorizing in the University of Medina and never applying what you're doing on the one hand, and Muslim politicians doing things without consultation or knowledge of moral and ethical principles on the other hand, this bridge needs to be gapped. For that reason, whether you're studying worship or you're criminal law, taxation, all of these can be theorized and rethought of along classical sources. That doesn't mean you only look at the classical sources. It means that the classical sources can serve as an inspiration for the contemporary jurists' active ijtihad. Thirdly, you have Islamic sociology and the social sciences. I think that the Muslim Ummah, especially in a place like Malaysia, has made extraordinary strides to revive sciences like Islamic sociology. And I don't think that we need further revival of Islamic sociology. What I do think we need is an application of those principles of sociology in order to see how we can actually implement them through real policy, through fiqh al-siyasa, through Islamic political thought. It's not just about, what did Ibn Khaldun think? We know what Ibn Khaldun thought, but what use is that today? And then finally, the notion, again, the jurists, they always had this on their mind. They had to deal with the practical realities of their world, but they never removed themselves or their goal from the act of perfection, from the virtuous society systematically theorized as the Khilafah ala Minhaj al-Nubuwah. That might not be possible to attain right now. It might be not possible to attain in the near future. But the second whether it's Khilafah ala Minhaj al-Nubuwah or any other ideal or normative value or virtue, the second we accept as a fait accompli that, we can try to do something better, but we're never going to attain perfection, that's when we lose, I think, as Muslims, because the Prophet ﷺ said, the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah has written ihsan into every action. So regardless of what you're doing, the notion of ihsan and of a superior goal to which we can strive, towards which we can strive, should remain on our thoughts as political theorists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jan, for your long and an insightful lecture. Navigating.
Very sorry for going over time.
It's okay. Navigating a long history of Islamic political thought. So now it's time for a Q&A session and comment sessions. The participants can either ask questions by unmuting themselves, or they can write the questions in the chat box. Is there anyone there?
I have a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. You can go ahead.
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Jan. It's a pleasure to have you here. May Allah reward your efforts in the month of Ramadan. Again, thank you for your time and for sharing. I think this has been a massive broadening of horizon for some, for me as well, especially. I just had a quick question, particularly on the point of the modern state system and the direction of course, maybe you wouldn't be able to sort of like really say, but of course, we sort of know the progression of the Westphalian system as one which was implemented by imposition on a global scale. The reality is that that's where we are currently, right? And having heard the points on leadership, the Sharia, of course, there's a discussion over the position of the Sharia, not just in relations to its sort of metaphysical position, but also its relationship with the state. I was just wondering, are we discussing, or where in the connection between the degree of control that states possess today and the degree of submission that you were mentioning earlier, and of course maybe a bit of a hint of maybe a future of statelessness, as in without a state. Where are we in this? Like, where, if I could sort of pick your mind on the direction we're heading, if you could understand the question.
The direction we're heading in terms of the nation-state system,
The
where
nation-state
it might be
system
going
and
toward?
the contemporary sort of more or less the temperature in the room at the moment. Are we?
I
Because again, like
I get your question.
The state
There are a lot of ways you can answer
inevitably,
the question, and thank
yeah,
you. And a very good question and very
yeah.
important.
Again, inevitably, the state will the modern state is a discussion on degree of control. Of course, ideally, it should be a question of a degree of submission. Of course, there's also another sort of possibility that perhaps we're not talking about states, that the Sharia is best served outside that sort of like structure. I mean, again, to pick your mind on this. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful question. Yeah. Firstly, I do think that the notion of the nation state, I thought perhaps I didn't make it clear, but definitely the notion of the nation state is, for me, opposed to many different Islamic principles on a moral level, on a legal level, on a sort of aqidah level, on a legal level as well. From those three different categories, and this is that might be the case, but the question is it always going to be like that, or is it? How might we theorize from a practical perspective? How might we theorize a post-nation state system? And I think that many people are very focused, including political theorists, including people like Salman Sayyid, for instance. They're very focused on the urban centers. They're focused on the sort of centers of power and hegemony. Let's say, urbanized areas, industrialized areas where the state is the most powerful and the strongest. And they think that any change to that system will be undertaken through decisions by those nation states. So let's say you have hegemony, the hegemonic nation state, different states in the Middle East, for instance, they decide to come together and say, look, let's change things up. Let's create something like the European Union. They're expecting, in other words, a top-down solution to this problem. And the difficulty of this is that the further you go up in terms of power and wealth, the further integrated those power systems are to the liberal international order. So the richer a person is, the more integrated they are, as a general rule, into the globalized capitalist system. So what is the chance that they're going to create a change outside of that capitalist system? The difference between Europe and the Middle East is that Europe is the center of that global system. The United States is at the center of that global system. It can fund the whole thing. Right, that's why they can unify easily, and because no one's going to stop them. On the other hand, if Muslim countries were to even attempt to do something similar, you can imagine what the response would be. You can imagine the lack of political will. This is my point. The lack of political will is partly political, it is partly legal, but it is also partly financial. It's economic, and it seems unlikely that this systemic change is going to take place from those same avenues of power. What seems more probable to me is that a post-nation state system is more likely to come out of the areas least under the control of the state, or least under the control of the global liberal capitalist order. And that's because you still have many societies, and Halak also mentioned this in one of his presentations, that there are many societies, including Muslim countries, that are very minimally touched by colonialism, that were minimally touched by colonialism, and the state has a very small, minute, minimum authority over government. And what I think, if we look at the world and certain perhaps events that have happened in the last few years, we can see that a lot of this change might take place from the peripheries of power and then come towards and the reason it would come from the peripheries is because they're willing to reconstitute society from scratch because they have nothing to invest. This goes back to Ibn Khaldun's point. See, Ibn Khaldun's point of change was the people who create change, they never make it from inside the system. It's always the people, the Bedouins who are outside the system, they come in and they take over all the decadent, political elites who are indulged in the dunyawi pleasures, and they establish something new. The question is this possible today? Because that was possible, before modernity, because the state was not as powerful. You didn't have conventional militaries. The amount of wealth was not comparable. And so I think that is that should be a priority for social scientists, if something like that is possible, if that makes sense. It's an area of study, I think, we can undertake.
I would like to ask a final question. It's not a question, actually. We hosted Professor Fazil and Andrew March, I think, before.
Okay.
2 months before. And what they are arguing, that kind of argument that, or kind of portrayal of modern state that you provided here, is an kind of extreme take of modern state. It's kind of a radical take, and so they propose that we don't need to take that much radically the constitution of the state. So they think that in a way, if we approach kind of liberal sentiments, we can have an Islamic state within modern state system. And that's their core point, as I have understood their argument when they share their insights here. I would like to ask your take on this argument, especially political liberalism, and try to engage using the political liberalism as a technology of developing an Islamic state concepts using maqasid sharia kind of arguments today, using maqasid sharia to understand modern state and also the modern law and how we can engage or reconcile with modernity. What's your take in this approach, on this approach, actually?
That's actually a very great question. Jazakallah khair. I think I have to perhaps review what Andrew March and Muhammad Fadl say, but I do know they're more or less, what the arguments are. And I think in response to their view of a potential Islamic government, the area that they might be right in saying, okay, we don't have to theorize of the nation state in the way that is completely contradictory to Islam. That was the same point Maududi made. It was the same point that Muslim scholars made before. It's not a new point. But I do think that from Maududi to our time, rahimahullah, we have so many cases of attempts, of projects, of we have basically, half a century or more of experience where we can now say, okay, from a political perspective, is this really possible? I would say two things to sort of clarify my answer. The first one is I think that the likes of Andrew March and others, they might be partially right about my understanding of the nation state, but their blind, their blind spot is Islamic law and traditional Islamic law. So the notion, for instance, that, again, if you want to use the notion that if if you think about the sort of cornerstones of the liberal democratic state, capitalism is essential to that, right? At least historically, it's been essential to that. Capitalism is predicated upon interest. Interest is one of the greatest major sins in Islam. And so in order to accommodate for a nation-state system or for a capitalist system, you have to either re-theorize capitalism, which is a very radical thing. No one's ever done it, and I don't think it's very possible. Or you have to justify capitalism using the language of usul al-fiqh. So what's the point then? We already have that world. If you want to justify things according to the language of usul al-fiqh and fill in the content with what already exists, the status quo, you don't have to change anything. We're already living in that world. And so if you look at fiqh proper and the way that it was practiced by the fuqaha through the majority of history, look at their take on interest, look at their view on the notion of, let's say, a law higher than the law of the state. They always held the sultans and the caliphs accountable to the divine law, right? Even in the Ottoman system, the sultan could be dethroned by the Shaykh al-Islam because of their opposition to the divine law. The point here is that there are so many aspects of, I think, proper fiqh that get thrown out of the window when trying to theorize of a modern state, precisely because Islamicization of a modern state requires moral compromise on many different principles. That's the first point. The second point is, put the fiqh to the side for a moment. If we just look at the attempt to Islamicize a society through the modern state, it assumes that we can cultivate a generation of citizens using the technology and the moral sort of the moral technologies and the institutions of the secular state to Islam, quote unquote, Islamicize that population. And ostensibly, this would take place by gaining a hold of the state powers itself through, quote unquote, legal means, through parliament or through whatever. The problem is, anytime anybody hints towards real practical, quote unquote, Islamic change through these bodies of the state, it's immediately shut down by another power. So anytime a quote unquote Islamic party, and Islamic parties are not, by the way, they're not the best reflections of Islamic values. But just to give an example, anytime there is an attempt to reform the state using the state powers itself, that is shut down through legitimate means, whether it's a coup or it's in the military saying you can't do that, or it's the judiciary, or it's somebody else. And so many cases in many different countries in the world, despite there being a popular will for it, simply hasn't been permitted. It's not permitted for. The global powers do not want, from a geopolitical perspective, from an international relations perspective, the United States nor any other power wants a unification between any two members of the Muslim world. So those are sort of reasons why I'm skeptical of their argument. If they're right, I would hope they're right. I would hope that Julani is right. Just to give a practical example, this is what March and what's it called, the other guys, this is what they're really envisioning as an example. But I think that, again, this will be one case. It'll show that it's not going to work. And that's from a sociological or Khaldunian perspective, I would say that.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jan. I think we are running out of time. And thank you for, it's time to wrap up actually. And thank you for all for joining us today for this insightful webinar. I think this talk or ideas of Dr. Jan will provide or provoke some conversations within our students also, where many of the students have been joined us today here. And so before I wrap up, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to our guest speaker, Dr. Jan Islam, who shared with us some insightful observations on Islam, philosophy, and political modernity. We hope that Dr. Jan will continue to enlighten us in our future webinar sessions. And also, we would like to invite him to Malaysia. I think he never been to Malaysia before, so now he just came to the Turkey. So it's a 7-8 hour flight from Istanbul to Kuala Lumpur. And also a big thank you for our audience, students, for their presence today. In addition, I'd like to thank Dr. Mir Alif, the head of Policy and Area Studies Research Unit. I think Dr. Jan might noted that the first person who asked the question is our head Policy of Areas Research.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way,
Wonderful.
he's a UK man. He's a LSE PhD. Yeah, he received his PhD in LSE. Now he's an assistant professor here. And he's our head here, Policy and Area Studies Research Unit. And also, I would like to thank his team, wonderful team, for facilitating, facilitating and helping us to conduct this webinar smoothly. Finally, also a final note. I have final note that we would like to announce that there is a 3-part lecture series coming up on the rise of far-right extremism, causes, consequences, and countermeasures, which we will run it from April to June 2025. The series aims to explore the complex factors driving far-right movements across the globe, from Europe to Australia, in Asia. And I think that given the global relevance of this issue, we believe that these conversations are both timely and necessary. And we would like to warmly invite all the participants, students, academics, and the members of the public to join us in these important discussions. We hope that this platform will encourage critical reflection and constructive dialogue, and we look forward to your active participation. And thank you. We hope to see you soon. With this information, I conclude this webinar by reciting Dua al-Kafara. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Thank you, Dr. Jan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your very kind invitation. It was a great pleasure and honor, and I look forward to working with everyone in the future.
Thank you. And also, we would like to invite you